Commander Velthus stared at the flashing red emergency beacon on his screen, feeling his stomach drop with each pulse. The massive luxury cruise ship Starhaven was dying out there in space, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. According to every rule in the book, the ship had been carrying 3,000 passengers on what was supposed to be a peaceful tour of the outer rim systems. Families on vacation, business travelers, even some newlyweds on their honeymoons. Now they were all trapped inside a metal coffin that was slowly falling apart near the Crimson Nebula. One of the most dangerous radiation storms in known space. His tactical officer, a nervous young alien with too many eyes, kept reading off numbers that made Velthus want to punch something. The radiation levels around that nebula could cook most galactic species in under 5 minutes. The energy readings were off every chart they had, getting worse by the hour. The Starhaven had suffered what engineers called a catastrophic cascade failure. First, the main engines had exploded, then the backup power grid started shorting out. And now the ship's hull was developing cracks that were letting deadly space radiation pour inside. The passengers were huddled in the central sections. But even those areas wouldn't protect them much longer. Standard galactic rescue protocols were very clear about situations like this. When dealing with extreme radiation environments, rescue teams needed at least 4 full days to prepare. They had to gather specialized equipment that could handle the radiation, modify their ships with extra shielding, and set up complete medical quarantine facilities to treat exposure victims. The problem was simple math. The Starhaven would be a floating graveyard. Long before they could mount a proper rescue operation, Velthus had been running rescue operations for over 20 years. He'd never lost this many people at once. The weight of those 3,000 lives pressed down on him like a physical force. He kept thinking about the distress messages they'd received before the ship's communications started failing. Scared voices asking when help would arrive, parents trying to keep their children calm, elderly passengers who couldn't understand why the lights kept flickering. His science officer, a brilliant researcher who rarely showed emotion, was practically whispering his reports now. Ship's life support systems were failing section by section. The artificial gravity was becoming unstable, causing people to float around and get injured when it suddenly kicked back in. Worse yet, the nebula itself was growing stronger, pulling the damaged ship deeper into its radioactive embrace. Every few minutes, another system would fail completely. First it was the recreational decks, then the dining areas, then the passenger quarters. The safe zone was shrinking like a noose, forcing everyone into smaller and more crowded spaces. The air recycling systems were working overtime and starting to break down under the stress. Velthus looked at the tactical displays showing his rescue fleet positioned at what regulations called a safe distance, 3 million kilometers away from the action, far enough that his crews wouldn't get fried by the radiation, but too far to actually help anyone. His ships were some of the most advanced in the galaxy, but they weren't built for this kind of extreme environment. He'd already sent preliminary reports to Galactic Command explaining the situation. The response had been predictably bureaucratic. Follow standard procedures, don't risk additional lives, document everything for the investigation that would follow. In other words, watch 3,000 people die and fill out the paperwork afterward. That's when his sensor operator called out something that changed everything. A new ship had just dropped out of hyperspace, ignoring every safety protocol by appearing right at the edge of the radiation field. The vessel's design was unfamiliar, angular and tough-looking compared to the smooth curves of galactic standard ships. The ship's identification signal made Velthus blink in surprise. It was human. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the Phoenix, studying the mess unfolding on his screens. His crew had responded to the distress call like they always did, dropping out of hyperspace as close to the action as their engines could manage. What they found was a disaster that had the entire alien rescue fleet sitting back and wringing their hands. His first officer, Angela Wells, was shaking her head as she monitored the alien communications. The rescue ships were positioned so far away they might as well have been in another star system. 3 million kilometers of empty space separated them from the people who desperately needed help. "Listen to this," Angela said, playing back some of the alien chatter. They're actually debating whether to classify this as a total loss. Can you believe that? 3,000 people are dying over there, and they're worried about filing the right paperwork. The radiation readings were definitely nasty. Morrison had to admit that much. The Crimson Nebula was pumping out enough deadly energy to kill most species in the galaxy within minutes. But humans weren't most species. They'd evolved on a planet that seemed determined to kill them every single day, and that had made them remarkably good at surviving things that shouldn't be survivable. Dr. Kevin Walsh, their chief medical officer, was already pulling up comparison data on his tablet. The man had worked disaster zones from toxic chemical spills to nuclear accidents. Back on Earth, he'd seen radiation exposure cases that would give alien doctors nightmares, and he'd learned how to treat them. The levels are high, but not impossible, Walsh reported. Remember that reactor breach on Europa Station? This is maybe 30% worse than that, and we pulled everyone out of there just fine. We'll need to rotate our teams frequently and monitor exposure carefully, but it's definitely doable. Morrison turned to his rescue coordinator, Rita Gonzalez, a woman who'd spent 15 years pulling people out of collapsed mines, burning skyscrapers and flooded subway tunnels. If anyone could figure out how to extract 3,000 passengers from a radioactive death trap, it was her. Rita was already sketching out approach vectors on her display, her fingers flying over the controls as she calculated entry points and evacuation routes. Her assessment was typically straightforward and practical. "We go in fast and hard," she said without looking up from her work. "No fancy maneuvers, no overthinking it. We dock with their ship, get our people inside, and start moving passengers. Work in 30-minute shifts to limit radiation exposure. Cycle our teams so nobody gets cooked. We can have the entire ship evacuated in under 12 hours if we move. Fast enough?" The alien commander's voice suddenly crackled over the communications system, filled with what sounded like panic and disbelief. Commander Velthus was practically shouting about how impossible their plan was, how their primitive technology couldn't possibly handle such extreme conditions. Morrison almost laughed at the word primitive. Human technology might look crude compared to the sleek alien designs, but it had one major advantage. It was built by people who understood that sometimes you had to work in conditions that would kill you if you weren't careful. Their environmental suits weren't pretty, but they'd been tested in some of the nastiest places humans had ever been. Radioactive zones, toxic atmospheres, the vacuum of space, underwater caves, volcanic vents. Human engineers had a saying that alien designers never seemed to understand. It didn't matter how advanced your equipment was if it broke down when you needed it most. "Commander Velthus," Morrison said into his communicator, keeping his voice calm and professional. "I understand your concern, but you need to understand something about humans. We've been pulling people out of impossible situations since before we even knew there were other species in the galaxy. House fires, mine collapses, sinking ships, chemical disasters, nuclear accidents. This is literally what we do," he gestured toward his crew already suiting up and preparing their equipment. "Every person on this ship has worked in conditions that your safety manuals probably classify as instantly lethal. We're not being reckless here. We're just operating by different standards than you're used to." The alien fleet continued to maintain their safe distance while the Phoenix moved closer to the dying cruise ship, ready to do what humans had always done best: rush toward danger when other people needed help. The Phoenix docked with the dying cruise ship with a metal-and-metal clang that echoed through both vessels. The first rescue team was already suited up and ready to go, their equipment checked and double-checked. Leading the team was veteran firefighter Dale Patterson, a man who'd spent 20 years running into burning buildings while everyone else ran out. Patterson had seen every kind of disaster you could imagine: apartment fires with people trapped on the upper floors, chemical plant explosions that turned the air toxic, collapsed parking garages where every step could trigger another cave-in. The radiation pouring off this ship was just another hazard to work around, no different from smoke or poison gas or unstable debris. Next to him stood paramedic Beth Johnson, loading her medical kit with supplies that would make alien doctors cringe. Human emergency medicine had developed in a world where you sometimes had to choose between aggressive treatment and certain death. Alien medical practices were much more cautious, much more gentle. that gentleness would get people killed. In a situation like this, the moment the airlock opened, Patterson and his team moved into the ship like they were entering a structure fire. No hesitation, no stopping to debate the risks. They had a job to do and limited time to do it. The radiation levels inside the ship were climbing steadily as the nebula's energy field grew stronger. The first thing Patterson noticed was how wrong everything felt. The artificial gravity was flickering on and off, making people float randomly before slamming them back down to the deck. Emergency lighting cast weird shadows everywhere, and there was a constant groaning sound as the ship's hull flexed under stress. It was never designed to handle Deck 7 had been completely blown out to space, leaving a gaping hole that was venting atmosphere and letting radiation pour in like water through a broken dam. Patterson keyed his radio without missing a step. Command, Deck 7 is gone. Looks like the explosion took out most of the forward section. We're rerouting through the maintenance tunnels to reach the passenger areas. Behind him, Johnson was already working on a group of injured aliens who'd been caught near the blast zone. These weren't species she'd trained to treat, but trauma was trauma regardless of how many limbs or eyes someone had. She worked fast, using human medical techniques that prioritized keeping people alive over keeping them comfortable. One of the passengers, a tall alien with blue skin and too many arms, was going into shock from radiation exposure. Johnson didn't have time for the careful, gradual treatment methods that alien medicine preferred. She hit the victim with a cocktail of human-designed drugs that would either stabilize him quickly or kill him quickly. In this situation, quick was the only option that mattered. "We need to move these people now," Johnson called out. "Their species can't handle much more radiation exposure, and the levels are climbing every minute we stay here." Engineer Tony Mitchell was already deep in the ship's guts, working with spare parts and jury-rigged connections to keep life support running in the passenger areas. Human engineering had always been about making things work with whatever materials you had available. Alien technology was more elegant, but elegance didn't help when half your systems were melted slag. Mitchell had learned his trade in asteroid mining operations, where equipment failure meant everyone died and there was no time to wait for replacement parts. He was ripping components out of non-essential systems and patching them into life support networks, creating connections that no alien engineer would ever approve, but that would keep people breathing for a few more hours. Rescue Specialist Tracy Adams was moving through the ship like a three-dimensional maze, mapping out safe routes through sections where the structure was still stable. She'd worked cave rescues and building collapses where one wrong step could bring the whole thing down on everyone's head. This ship was just another unstable structure that needed to be navigated carefully. The alien passengers watched all of this happening with expressions of amazement and terror. These humans were working calmly in conditions that represented certain death to most galactic species. They moved through radiation fields like they were walking through rain, handled emergency procedures like they were routine maintenance, and treated injuries with a confidence that bordered on recklessness. What the aliens didn't understand was that this was just another day at the office for humans who'd grown up on a planet that was constantly trying to kill them. The Starhaven was coming apart like a jigsaw puzzle in an earthquake. What had started as a controlled rescue operation was turning into something that would give safety inspectors nightmares for decades. Huge chunks of the ship's outer hull were breaking away and tumbling into the nebula's radioactive glow, taking entire decks with them. Team leader Bobby Garcia watched a section, size of a city block, tear loose from the ship's superstructure and spin away into space. Inside his helmet, sweat was running down his face as he calculated how much time they had left before the whole thing came apart. Not long, and definitely not long enough to evacuate. Everyone using normal methods, the artificial gravity system had given up any pretense of working properly. People were floating around randomly, then suddenly getting slammed into bulkheads when the system flickered back to life for a few seconds. The emergency lighting was strobing like a disco, and there was atmosphere venting out through so many hull breaches that the ship sounded like a giant whistle. Garcia had worked demolition before joining the rescue service. He knew explosives, knew how to use them to create openings without bringing down entire structures. Right now, that knowledge was the only thing standing between 300 trapped passengers and a very unpleasant death. "Stand back, people," he called out as he placed shaped charges along a section of twisted metal that was blocking their path to the passenger compartments. "We're going to make our own door." The controlled explosion sent chunks of debris flying, but it cleared a passage that would have taken hours to cut with conventional tools. Behind the wreckage, Garcia could see scared faces pressed against a viewport. Families huddled together, elderly passengers who couldn't understand what was happening, children crying in their parents' arms. 3 decks down, Dr. Helen Walsh and medic Carl Turner were dealing with their own impossible situation. A section of the ship had collapsed, trapping dozens of passengers under twisted metal and broken machinery. The only way to reach them was by rappelling through a debris field in zero gravity, navigating around chunks of metal that could crush a person if they made one wrong move. Walsh had trained in combat medicine, working in field hospitals where doctors had to make split-second decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. She'd performed surgery and bombed out buildings while artillery shells exploded overhead. This was just another day at the office, except the office happened to be a radioactive death trap in space. Turner was right behind her, carrying medical supplies and trying not to think about how many safety regulations they were breaking. 2 of them moved through the debris field like they were swimming underwater, using pieces of wreckage as handholds to pull themselves toward the trapped passengers. When they reached the survivors, Walsh immediately went to work with tools and techniques that would horrify most alien doctors. She performed field surgery using emergency lighting, making decisions in seconds that alien medical committees would debate for hours. Her approach was simple: keep people alive first, worry about proper procedure later. One passenger had a piece of metal lodged in his chest cavity. In a proper hospital, removing it would require hours of careful surgery. Walsh pulled it out in 30 seconds, sealed the wound with medical foam, and moved on to the next patient. The alien observers watching through helmet cameras were probably having heart attacks, but the patient was still breathing. Commander Veltha's voice kept crackling over the communications system, pleading with the human teams to withdraw before the situation got any worse. His words were getting more desperate by the minute as he watched these humans work in conditions that should have killed them 10 times over. "Human teams, this is beyond acceptable risk parameters." He transmitted for probably the 100th time. "You must withdraw immediately. The structural integrity is failing rapidly." Captain Morrison's response was calm and steady, like he was discussing the weather instead of a life-or-death rescue operation in the middle of a cosmic radiation storm. "Negative, Commander. We don't leave people behind. Ever." That simple statement said everything about the difference between humans and the rest of the galaxy. Other species calculated acceptable losses and followed safety protocols. Humans just kept working until everyone was safe, or they were dead. The last human rescue team came stumbling out of the Starhaven's twisted wreckage just as the ship finally gave up its fight for survival. Team leader Danny Brooks was carrying an elderly alien passenger who'd been trapped in the ship's central core, while his partner Jessica Adams helped a family of 4-armed aliens navigate through the airlock to safety. Behind them, Starhaven was putting on its final show. The massive cruise ship broke apart in a cascade of explosions that lit up the entire nebula like the galaxy's most expensive fireworks display. Chunks of metal the size of buildings tumbled through space, glowing white-hot from the radiation. They'd absorbed. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, and it marked the end of what should have been an impossible rescue operation. The Phoenix's medical bay was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Dr. Kevin Walsh was working alongside alien medical staff who kept staring at his treatment methods like they were watching someone perform surgery with a chainsaw. Human emergency medicine didn't have time for the gentle, cautious approaches that most galactic species prefer. Walsh was performing direct blood transfusions using techniques that made the alien doctors visibly cringe. He was injecting radiation exposure victims with aggressive chemical cocktails, designed to flush toxins from their systems before permanent damage could set in. 2 alien physicians. These treatments looked barbaric and dangerous. To Walsh, they were Tuesday afternoon at the emergency room. One alien doctor, whose species had never developed anything more aggressive than herbal tea for medical treatment, watched Walsh perform what humans called minor surgery. The patient had internal bleeding from radiation damage, and Walsh opened him up right there on the treatment table, repaired the damaged tissue, and had him sewn up again in under an hour. The final count was written on a whiteboard in the Phoenix's command center, numbers that would be talked about in rescue academies for decades to come. 2,994 lives saved. 6 passengers lost, all from injuries they'd sustained before the human teams even arrived on scene. Commander Velthus was sitting in the Phoenix's medical bay, nursing radiation burns on his arms and face from a brief exposure to conditions. The human teams had worked in for nearly 20 hours straight. His hands were shaking as he filed his official report, partly from the radiation sickness and partly from the shock of what he'd witnessed. He'd been running rescue operations for over 2 decades, and he'd never seen anything like what these humans had accomplished. They'd worked in conditions that should have killed them within minutes. They'd saved people who were already written off as casualties by every standard in the Galactic Rescue Manual. They'd done the impossible and made it look routine. Captain Marson found him later, sitting alone in the medical bay with a cup of something that vaguely resembled coffee but tasted like liquid regret. The human captain looked tired but satisfied, like someone who'd just finished a difficult but successful day at the office. "How?" Velthus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the only question that mattered. How had they done what? Every expert in the galaxy said was impossible? Morrison sat down across from him, accepting a cup of the terrible alien coffee with a grateful nod. His answer was simple and direct, the kind of explanation that humans were famous for. "Commander, every world in this galaxy is what we call a garden world. Beautiful, safe, comfortable places where the biggest danger might be a mild rainstorm or a seasonal temperature change. Our planet has been trying to kill us since the day we evolved opposable thumbs," he gestured toward his crew, who were cleaning equipment and checking on patients with the calm efficiency of people who'd done this kind of work many times before. "We learned a long time ago that sometimes the most civilized thing you can do is act a little savage. When lives are on the line, we don't follow safety protocols when people are dying. We make new protocols." 6 months later, the first Galactic Human Rescue Academy opened on Luna, Earth's moon. Garden World species came from across the galaxy to learn from the humans who had redefined what rescue operations could accomplish. They learned that impossible was just another word for Tuesday when you came from a death world.